Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Friedman, all the organizers of the seminar, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be in Frankfurt. Many thanks for the invitation, and I'm very grateful particularly to the organizers for permitting me to speak in English on this occasion. Es tut mir leid, ich bedanke mich für Ihre Geduld. I used to be a BBC correspondent in Germany as well as in Asia and other places, but that's more than 20 years ago that I was here, and my memory of Frankfurt has to do with the ethics and role of journalists to tell the truth and accuracy, because one of my worst tasks as a Bonn correspondent based in Bonn was to, when there was a press conference of the Bundesbank, the BUBA, I was only given about an hour, and you know it takes a bit more than an hour to get from Bonn, so I had to go down the A3, drive very fast to get there, to report instantly about Bundesbank announcements about interest rate rises. On one occasion, one of the news agencies was trying too hard. They reported wrongly that there was an interest rate rise, and Reuters, the other agency that was there, was able to launch an advertising campaign for years afterwards saying, you know, the others rush and get it wrong, we always get it right. I should say just a word about where I'm coming from to explain the context of what I'm going to say. I was with the BBC for more than 30 years, a lot of it on the road as a foreign correspondent. But then when I left, about 10 years ago, I decided to be a troublemaker. I decided that the issue of the Fourth Estate and the mugging of journalism, which was already well advanced, needed my attention. So in a small way, I wanted to change the world, and that's your concern as well today. So I did have a role in some of the big institutional developments that have happened with my organizations, with the big institutional changes that have happened in the last 10 years or so. One is the startup of the United Nations Action Plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. It was actually originally proposed by Britain, and we got support from others, and it blossomed into a multi-stakeholder massive enterprise with meetings chaired by the Secretary General himself. In terms of the Council of Europe, I represent the Association of European Journalists, and the meetings there were very dull and boring, and I and others helped to change the conversation at the Council of Europe from merely setting standards in this area to implementing the standards. And that is now a major focus of the work of the Council of Europe. And if you look at coe.int, /FOM, Freedom of the Media, you will see the world's first continent-wide real-time alert system for attacks on the press and the safety of journalists. Nearly 400 alerts registered last year, and in February we'll be having an annual report from the side of the media and NGOs which work with the Council of Europe on this. My point is, a lot of journalists see their role as, you know, the classic role above the fray, neutral, we mustn't be part of the story. I think the situation is so critical, and we've heard today, that it's necessary for journalists to understand that now they are targets, and also the media landscape is now a battleground for democracy, as Mr. Nemitz himself, I think, was suggesting. So we discussed the accuracy of news reporting on something like interest rates. The world has changed so much, the media landscape has changed so much in the 20-plus years since then. We've moved from a situation of information scarcity to one of information overload, and the first result, of course, is that news appears to be cheap and free, and although media has been democratized, everybody has a voice in the way that they didn't in the past, the result has been catastrophic for the traditional creators of reliable news. Why? Because the internet giants have become the landlords and the masters of the internet, and we've become the tenants. We used to produce the story, but we also had the delivery system. Now all that has changed. Now the hard evidence of the link between the reliance of populations on social media, on unreliable news, and the mistrust in the media and populism is clear-cut. There's one study by the Pew Institute organization in America, which shows this extremely clearly in a graph if you want to look. But to me, the most important thing about this huge change in the media market and landscape is not so much the loss of status or money of the media. It is that the space has been created for politicians, for the state, to invade the media space, the fusion of media and politics, and to seek to influence the story, to create often an exclusive narrative, sometimes a national one, sometimes an ethnic one. Anyway, it's very often, and in order to do it, they have to either coerce or co-opt the media that are there. And that, in a sense, is the story of what I'm going to say to you today, to have a look at how that is done. It's always said information is power, and in the media sphere now, the arena is such a fierce battleground that politicians are reluctant to accept the traditional role of the media as watchdog. They try to reverse it. They want to push back. And, of course, the classic is Donald Trump himself, who sent his press secretary into the press room the first day to tell the media, you're not going to scrutinize us, we're going to turn the tables and scrutinize you. And that theme has come back again in the White House. This is a very fundamental challenge to the role of the media as the watchdog, as the representative of the people. And the loose language and the sense that everybody's opinion is valid and that you can create your alternative facts is contagious. We see it all over Europe. For example, in my own country, when we started the referendum campaign about Brexit, there was a very smart, internet-savvy man behind the scenes of the campaign for Leave, and he said afterwards that we threw out the most outrageous statements and misleading statements. We found that people liked it. It was effective, so we did more of it. And the regulators in the UK, unfortunately, were unable really to pick that up. But I'm an optimist. Let me quote you from the words of the Council of Europe ministers. This is a recommendation in 2016 on the protection of journalists and the safety of journalists and other media actors. And it says that it's unacceptable now that journalists are being threatened, intimidated, arbitrarily jailed, physically attacked, and even killed because of their work. Now, I should admit I was a member of that committee. It was partly state members, partly independent members. And the key thing to it is something absolutely unique in international affairs. It is that the ministers themselves urge their governments to conduct or to enable an independent review of all their laws and policies related to the functioning of journalism and freedom of expression. It's an extraordinary thing in paper. It hasn't happened yet, although efforts are being made, including at an academic level. People might be interested to discuss that with me. But it includes the most sensitive areas of public affairs, anti-terrorism laws, national security, etc. So these are ways in which the civil society and the informed public have a chance to get back, so that the safeguards for freedom of expression and particularly for press freedom can eventually be upheld. Now, you know very well, and I mentioned the platform for the safety of journalists, which has added its voice and its data to that of all the intergovernmental organizations like the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and also the Reporters Without Borders, and in a very valuable way. Now, what about the EU? Well, the clearest evidence, obviously, of a very dramatic worsening are the two terrible murders. We've already heard about them today. Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta and Jan Kuciak and his fiancée in Slovakia. But it's worth looking at the context, at what was really happening to those people. They were working in isolation against the combined forces of the elite of their societies, effectively, on stories to root out corruption. They did not have the support they should have done. In Malta, in particular, Daphne was facing nearly 50 separate defamation claims, which would have bankrupted her many times over. She'd had a bank account arbitrarily closed, although she had heroically exposed the Maltese side of the money laundering scandal in the Panama Papers and so on. And in the case of Jan Kuciak, he was onto the trail of deep penetration by a part of the mafia into high levels of Slovak public affairs, politics, and in particular on the issue of the distribution of EU funds. So, in other words, physical harassment is combined with arbitrary legal and administrative harassment as the ruling forces, ruling classes or elites try to silence those voices. And of course, the issue of impunity is vital here. The UN plan is called the UN Action Plan on the Safety of Journalists, and the issue of impunity. This is key. Freedom of expression and the rule of law, the two wheels on the bicycle. And in both those cases, the Caruana case and the Kuciak case, months have passed, and there's no sign that the investigators have got any further forward in identifying not the killers, but the people who ordered it. These were both hitmen. These were hitmen, mafia-type killings. So I want to, in the second half, I want to go into a little bit of how the state actors and the political actors and their allies perform this act of trying to take over and control the narrative. But I just want to pull back for a moment and share with you a couple of background statistics and so on. One is the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has a year ago, it published an exhaustive survey of journalists killed in the OSCE area. That's 57 states now, since 1992. And they came up with the figure of 392. That is a horrific figure, particularly since 9 out of 10 of those cases, there was the cases of impunity. There were no perpetrators were brought to justice. But also, it's almost 1/3 of the world's total. The United Nations, the UNESCO has a website, a real-time website where they condemn and track all killings of journalists, and they also track the impunity issue. So the OSCE area, in that time frame, accounts for almost 1/3 of the whole lot. Another thing to bear in mind is the difficulty for great powers, for the big countries, to recognize their own faults. And this, I think, is really quite serious. In international affairs, but also in this issue as well. There's a book by Chris Patterson of Leeds University called War Reporters Under Threat, published in 2014. According to his public source information, the US Army or military contractors killed 48 journalists and media workers in a short period of 8 years, from 1999 to 2007, in Iraq and Afghanistan, including the infamous case of the Iraq war logs of the American helicopter deliberately shooting and killing 2 Reuters journalists on the ground in Baghdad. And Israel, according to his figures, responsible for at least 14 journalists, Palestinian and others, in the 20 years or so up to 2014. It's important to recognize that on the positive side, the international recognition, though. Part of my argument is about the recognition of this challenge to the international rules-based order of the assault on journalists and on the press. Two very quick examples. In the Jamal Khashoggi case in Istanbul, the Saudi consulate there, immediately after it happened, the BBC asked the UN Secretary General about it, and he said, because Khashoggi, of course, had written his last column for the Washington Post, in which he had said that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf had become a mental prison for their people because the information control was so total. And his solution was the values of international verified media. And Gutierrez said, this kind of incident is multiplying. It's absolutely necessary for the international community to say such things cannot happen. Was he talking about the deadly nerve agent attack by Russian agents in Salisbury? Was he talking about the Daphne Caruana case? Probably that and many, many more. And recently in the UK, the British government has announced in the last few weeks that it was going to make media freedom and the safety of journalists one of its top priorities of British foreign policy for the next year, starting this year. And Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, has put it in terms of the international rules-based order needing to be protected and the crucial role of journalists in that business of holding power to account and not allowing these monopolies of information and the information narrative. Christian Amanpour of CNN put it very eloquently a few years ago. She said, whether it's Syria, Libya, Russia, the Philippines, journalists are now being targeted. They want to shut us up. Then he said, they're killing the messenger, and the West has failed to shore up the rule of law and guarantees for free speech. So, now quickly, my three instances of the techniques and ways in which governments and other powerful forces take over the media space, even in this hugely complex and multiple space that we all share on the internet. There's the Russia model, what I'm going to call the Russia model, the George Bush you're either with us or with the terrorists initiative, and take a look at some of the challenges of the EU itself quickly. Okay, so the Russia model is absolutely clear-cut. If you look at what happened very quickly after Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, there was a Stalin-style takeover of the ground, of the heights of the media by fair means and foul, with exiles going to London and elsewhere. There was extremism laws which could be arbitrarily applied. Foreign agent laws against the foreign media, which is now threatening the BBC and others, the criminalizing of dissent with extremely heavy fines, the arbitrary work of the regulator, Roskomnadzor, closing down websites which are critical, closing out Dodge TV, the only, or one of the only really credible critical TV stations which exposed the activities of Russian fighters in Ukraine and so on, and weaponizing the main media, especially TV and RT, against the enemies of the regime. And, of course, disinformation. The classic line, nothing is true and everything is possible. That was the title of another book about the Russian disinformation campaign. Okay, I'm being asked to hurry up. So very quickly, obviously the Hungarian case follows the Putin model in a sense, but this time the takeover of the plurality of the landscape, which has been mentioned earlier, was done softly by allies and by starving the critical media of advertising and then being able to buy them up by allies of the government very, very quickly. Secondly, just a quote from, you remember the name Peter Greste. Peter Greste was the Australian TV journalist who was jailed in Egypt for a year. And when he came out, he blamed partly the statement of George W. Bush right after 2001 attacks on America, when he said, "You're either with us or with the terrorists." And Greste's analysis, I think he's right, is that statement and what followed in terms of states across the world enacting, seizing more power in the name of the fight against terrorism has taken away the neutral ground, which is the essential ground for journalists to hold power to account. And it had impacts in my country with excesses by the government, for example, over snooping, surveillance of journalists' telephone records simply in order to expose whistleblowers, even when the police had a case to answer, and places like Egypt and Turkey. And I'll quickly, on the EU, I mean, this is a very ambiguous area, so I'll give you a few more paradoxes, ambiguities. The EU is the beneficiary of what I call probably one of the greatest human achievements of the 20th century, which was the creation from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70 years ago, last month, to this extraordinary network we have now of regional and UN bodies which do uphold rights, which in the case of the Council of Europe and the Strasbourg Court gives individual right of petition to each individual to go there. But of course it's the nation. There are 10,000 cases at the Strasbourg Court which have been refused or have been simply rejected by member states. So it all comes back to the member states. I would also say the EU, I think Mr. Nemitz touched on this, there is a problem of double standards here, lecturing the rest of the world or the candidate countries to get up to standard on their norms on press freedom and then leaving the member states to their own devices. So I'll leave it there so that we have some time for questions, but I've had a very stimulating evening myself, so I'm grateful to you all, and I look forward to our conversation.